Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Gilgo Beach Killer, 10 bodies found along a single stretch of Long Island Highway, hidden in plain sight for years. Buried evidence, ignored leads, one discarded phone. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There is something quietly compelling about the way we seek out stories in the dark. Not just any stories, but the ones that make us lean in a little closer. The ones that ask us to pay attention, to follow the thread, to sit with the uncomfortable weight of something unresolved. Tonight, we are not following a single case through the shadows. Tonight, we are doing something a little different. We are following the stories behind the stories. The communities. The listeners. The readers. The quiet, searching minds who gather in corners of the internet, long after midnight, asking one simple question. What should I be paying attention to next? Part 1, The Archive That Never Closes. What does it mean to be drawn to true crime? Not the sensational version, not the shock and the spectacle, but the quieter pull. The one that happens when you're lying in the dark and you find yourself thinking about a case from 30 years ago, in a town you've never visited, involving people whose names you've read 100 times. There is something in that pull worth examining. Something honest. Something deeply, persistently human. On any given day, in the corner of Reddit known as r/true crime, a thread appears. It has appeared reliably, month after month, for years. It carries a modest title. Something along the lines of, "What are you listening to, reading, or watching right now?" And quietly, almost without ceremony, hundreds of people arrive. They leave recommendations. They ask questions. They mention a podcast that helped them understand a case they'd been thinking about for years. They describe a documentary that finally, carefully, gave a victim their name back. They share the book that kept them up until 3 in the morning, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of wanting to understand. This thread is not a crime scene. There is no victim here in the traditional sense. There is no perpetrator being sought, no evidence being logged, no detective working a cold case by lamplight in a cramped office. And yet, there is something worth investigating here. Something that I think, if we follow it carefully enough, tells us a great deal about why true crime matters. About what it does for us. About the strange and serious work of bearing witness to events we did not personally experience, in order to arrive somewhere closer to understanding. Let me tell you about the landscape, first. True crime, as a genre, is one of the oldest forms of storytelling in the human record. Before podcasts. Before streaming platforms. Before the 24-hour news cycle. Before paperbacks and broadsheets and penny pamphlets. Human beings have always gathered to tell stories about violence, about mystery, about justice sought and sometimes found and sometimes not found at all. There is a reason these stories endure. There is a reason they travel. They ask something of us that comfortable stories do not. They ask us to look directly at the worst things people do to one another, and to refuse to look away. Not for entertainment. Not for the rush of imagined danger. But because somewhere in the looking, in the careful and sustained attention to detail and timeline and evidence, we find something essential. We find the shape of human decision-making at its most consequential. We find the texture of grief, of loss, of institutional failure, of remarkable persistence. We find the investigators who spent decades on a single case. The journalists who re-examined files everyone else had forgotten. The families who never stopped asking questions. And we find, sometimes, in a small thread on the internet, hundreds of strangers pointing each other toward exactly the stories they needed to find. That structure matters, I think. It mirrors something true about the way crime media itself works. The newest cases are loudest. They have momentum, urgency, the particular electricity of the unresolved. But the older cases, the ones buried deeper in the archive, often carry the most weight. They have had time. Time for the evidence to be reconsidered, for confessions to emerge or collapse, for families to speak, for investigators to retire and look back with different eyes. In this thread, you might find someone recommending a podcast about a 1980s disappearance in a rural county. And right beside it, someone asking whether anyone has covered a case from last year that they can't stop thinking about. The old and the new, sitting together. The resolved and the unresolved, existing in the same space without competition. This is what the true crime community looks like from the inside. Not the caricature, not the voyeurs and the thrill seekers, but the real thing. People who read the room slowly. Who listened to the same episode twice to make sure they caught everything. Who write thoughtful responses about the emotional toll of a particular series. Who warn each other, gently, about content that might be unexpectedly difficult. Who leave notes like, "This one is slow but worth it," or, "This one is devastating but important," or, "This one finally gets it right." I want to spend tonight inside that community. I want to look at what people are finding, and what they're looking for, and what that looking tells us about the nature of this work, the work of understanding crime not as spectacle, but as history. As testimony. As a form of reckoning. And I want to begin with a question that I think sits quietly beneath almost every recommendation in that thread. When we seek out a crime story, what are we really searching for? Part 2, The Listener and the Case. What draws a person to a particular story, and not another? This question is worth sitting with, because the true crime audience is not a monolith. It is not, as it is sometimes portrayed, a single type of person with a single type of appetite. The people who populate forums like r/truecrime, who leave recommendations in monthly threads, who build personal libraries of crime podcasts organized by geography or era or type of crime, these people arrive from entirely different directions. They carry entirely different reasons with them. Some come because of a personal connection. A case happened near where they grew up. A victim shares a name with someone they loved. A crime touched their community in a way that was never properly addressed, never fully explained, never resolved to anyone's satisfaction. These listeners are not passive. They bring a kind of urgent, specific attention that is different from curiosity. It is closer to obligation. Closer to witness. Others come from professional adjacency. Former law enforcement officers, listening to true crime podcasts not for the drama but to examine the investigative methodology. Social workers who follow cases involving systemic failure. Journalists who use crime media as a secondary research tool, cross-referencing public-facing coverage with the deeper archival work they do privately. These listeners often have the most precise critical perspective. They are quick to notice when a podcast oversimplifies an evidence chain, or when a documentary film frames a subject in a way that is slightly unfair, slightly unverified. They leave the most useful corrections in comment threads, usually very quietly, without fanfare. And then there are the people who come for the pure, sustained exercise of intellectual attention. The puzzle solvers. The pattern recognizers. The people who listen to a cold case episode and begin, instinctively, to map the timeline in their heads. To ask, what do we know, and when did we know it, and what does the absence of information tell us? These listeners have an almost academic relationship with crime media. They are not particularly interested in the emotional texture of a case. They want the evidence. They want the logical architecture. They want to know whether the forensic analysis holds up under scrutiny. What is remarkable about a space like that monthly recommendation thread is that all of these listeners coexist. Their recommendations overlap in unexpected ways. A podcast recommended by a former investigator for its rigorous evidence presentation turns out to also be recommended by a grieving community member because it finally treated the victim as a full human being. A documentary flagged by a journalist for its archival access is flagged by an amateur researcher for the same reason. The reasons converge, even when the people are very different. This convergence is not accidental. The best true crime work, the kind that earns sustained, reverent recommendations in communities like this one, tends to do something specific. It tends to treat the case as what it actually is, not a puzzle for entertainment, but a rupture in human life that demands careful, sustained, respectful examination. The best work in this genre carries the weight of its subject. It does not rush. It does not sensationalize. It does not reduce victims to their wounds or their final moments. It restores them, carefully, to the full dimension of their lives. And listeners know the difference. They have always known the difference. The community noticed. And the community remembered. By the early 2020s, the recommendations in that thread had shifted in a subtle but important way. People were increasingly seeking out what you might call the second wave, true crime work that was more careful about consent, more attentive to the needs of surviving family members, more willing to sit with uncertainty rather than forcing a narrative resolution that the evidence did not actually support. Work that said, clearly, we do not know who did this. We may never know. And here is why that matters. This shift reflects something I find genuinely hopeful about the community. It is not a passive audience. It is not a group that simply consumes whatever arrives in its feed. It is an audience that has developed, collectively and over time, a sophisticated set of criteria for what constitutes good crime journalism, good crime storytelling, good crime documentation. And those criteria are fundamentally ethical ones. Does this work treat the victim with dignity? Does it present the evidence accurately, without embellishment? Does it acknowledge the limits of its own knowledge? Does it consider the impact it might have, on ongoing investigations, on grieving families, on suspects who have not been charged or convicted? These questions appear, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly, in the recommendations people leave for each other. They are the invisible scaffolding of a community doing serious, careful, self-regulating work. Part 3, The Geography of Unsolved. Why do certain cases travel further than others? This is one of the subtler mysteries of the crime media landscape. Two cases happen in the same decade, in the same region, involving similar circumstances. One becomes the subject of multiple documentaries, a best-selling book, a podcast series that runs for 3 seasons and thousands of hours of engagement. The other remains known only to the family, the local investigators, and a handful of researchers who stumbled across it in a courthouse archive. Why? The honest answer is uncomfortable. And the true crime community, to its credit, has spent considerable time sitting with that discomfort. Because the answer, when examined carefully, tends to involve factors that have nothing to do with the severity of the crime, or the quality of the investigation, or the grief of the family involved. It tends to involve factors like the race of the victim, the economic status of the community, the geographic proximity to major media markets, the existence or absence of a compelling narrative hook in the early news coverage. These are not factors that reflect well on the media ecosystem. And the people in that monthly thread are not unaware of them. Among the most consistent themes in true crime recommendation threads is the active seeking out of cases that have been undercovered. People specifically ask, can someone recommend a podcast that covers cases involving communities of color? Can someone point me toward journalism about missing Indigenous women? Is there coverage of this particular case from rural Appalachia, or this particular family from a small farming town, that I haven't been able to find? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes someone arrives with exactly the right recommendation, a podcast produced by journalists who have been specifically committed to addressing the disparity in true crime coverage. A documentary made by a filmmaker embedded in a community, trusted by that community, given access that outside journalists were never offered. A book written by someone who spent years with a family before putting a single word on paper. These recommendations carry a particular quality of weight in the thread. The person leaving them is not simply saying this was entertaining. They are saying this was necessary. This was the work that needed to be done, and someone did it. But sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the person asking has identified a gap that hasn't been filled yet. And this, too, is part of what the community does. It maps the absences. It names the cases that don't yet have advocates in the media landscape, and in doing so, it keeps a kind of informal archive. An archive that occasionally, given enough time and enough attention, becomes the foundation for exactly the kind of coverage that was missing. There are podcast series that exist today because a question was asked in a forum thread. There are investigative journalists who found their next project through a tip left in a comments section by someone who had been researching a local case for years and finally found the right person to pass it to. The boundary between the audience and the creator, in true crime, is thinner than it is in almost any other genre. This is partly because of the nature of the subject matter. Crime investigations have a structure that invites participation. Evidence can be examined by anyone who has access to court records. Timelines can be reconstructed by anyone willing to do the work. Geographic and physical evidence can be analyzed, mapped, contextualized by people without law enforcement credentials who simply have expertise in other relevant fields, geography, psychology, forensic science, law. And it is a space where the geography of Unsolved becomes, slowly, slightly less tilted. Where the cases that got less coverage receive, at least, the sustained and thoughtful attention of a community that has chosen to pay it. Part 4, The Craft of Listening. What does it take to do this work well? I don't mean the investigation itself, the forensic work, the interview techniques, the legal process. I mean the work of translating a case into something that can be heard, or read, or watched. The work of taking an archive of evidence and human experience and rendering it in a form that serves the truth, rather than flattening it. This is an underappreciated craft question. And in the recommendation threads of communities like r/True Crime, it is discussed with a specificity and sophistication that would surprise people who imagine the true crime audience as uncritical consumers. People talk about pacing. Not in the abstract, but in specific terms. They note when a podcast rushes through the backstory of a victim and spends too much time on the procedural drama of the investigation. They note when a documentary lingers too long on crime scene imagery and not long enough on the family's ongoing experience of loss. They note the difference between a host who reads their script in a way that signals genuine engagement and one who sounds as though they are narrating a Wikipedia summary at speed. People talk about sourcing. They notice when a podcast episode is built almost entirely on secondary sources, news coverage, publicly available documents, versus one that has done original reporting. They notice when a documentary filmmaker has clearly spent time in a community versus one that parachuted in for a week and left. They value depth, and they can identify its absence. People talk about the treatment of uncertainty. One of the clearest markers of quality in true crime journalism, as the community has collectively identified it, is the willingness to say, "We don't know." This is not a comfortable position for a storyteller to occupy. Narrative wants resolution. Listeners, in a basic sense, want answers. And yet the best true crime work earns its uncertainty honestly, presents the evidence fully, and then leaves space for the conclusion to be incomplete. Because often, in the reality of an unsolved or ambiguously resolved case, incompleteness is the most truthful thing a journalist can offer. People in recommendation threads are remarkably good at identifying this quality. They describe it in different ways. Some say the podcast respected the limits of what it knew, some say it was honest about the gaps, some simply say it didn't pretend to have the answer when it didn't. But they are describing the same thing. And they value it. There is also a great deal of discussion, in threads like this one, about the ethics of intimacy. True crime, as a form, often places the audience in close proximity to grief. A podcast that interviews surviving family members. A documentary that includes footage of someone receiving news of a death. A book that renders, in careful prose, the private interior life of a victim. This intimacy can be one of the most powerful and important things crime media does. It restores dimensionality to people who have been reduced to case numbers. It makes the audience feel the weight of the loss in a way that statistics and summaries cannot. But it can also be invasive. It can re-traumatize families who agreed to participate in a project with one set of expectations and found themselves in something that felt, in the finished product, exploitative. It can place children and siblings and partners in a spotlight they did not ask for and cannot control. It can turn private grief into public spectacle without the fully informed consent of everyone involved. The community knows this. They discuss it. They are more likely now than they were 5 years ago to note, in a recommendation, that this one handled the family interview with exceptional care, or conversely, to flag that this documentary included footage of a grieving parent that felt unnecessarily intrusive. These are ethical judgments, and they are being made by ordinary listeners who have developed, through sustained engagement with the genre, a serious ethical framework for evaluating the work. That framework did not come from nowhere. It came from the cases where things went wrong. Where a podcast named a suspect who had not been charged and that person's life was severely disrupted by the public attention. Where a documentary included identifying information about a witness who had specifically asked not to be identified. Where a book's description of a crime scene was so detailed that the victim's family, reading it, felt violated all over again. These failures are part of the community's shared memory. They serve as reference points for what careful, ethical true crime journalism is working to avoid. What do people actually say when they come looking? There is something worth slowing down for, in the actual texture of what people share in a community recommendation thread. Not the titles matter less than you might think. What matters more is the language people use to describe their experience of a particular piece of crime media. Because in that language, you can read something true about what they were looking for, and whether they found it. Someone describes listening to a podcast about a cold case during a long drive and says, "It made me feel like I was sitting in the room with the investigator, looking at the same photographs, asking the same questions. I couldn't turn it off because I didn't want to lose the thread." Someone else describes a documentary about a wrongful conviction and says, "I kept having to pause and sit with what I'd just seen. It wasn't upsetting in a frightening way. It was upsetting in the way that important things are. The kind of upset that makes you want to understand the system better." Someone describes a book they finished the previous night and says, "The author was clearly someone who loved the person at the center of this story. Not in a way that compromised the journalism, but in a way that made every fact feel like it mattered. I haven't read anything like it in years." These descriptions are not reviews in any formal sense. They are not trying to persuade. They are trying to pass something along, the particular quality of an experience that they want someone else to be able to have. They are performing a kind of generosity that I think is undervalued in discussions about true crime fandom. Because what is happening in these threads is, in a fundamental way, the same thing that happens whenever human beings gather to share stories. It is the ancient, persistent impulse to say, "I found something that illuminated something true. Come and see it. It matters." There are people in these threads who have been coming back, month after month, for years. Who remember what they recommended 2 years ago and can tell you now whether subsequent coverage changed their understanding of the case. Who maintain mental maps of the true crime landscape that are genuinely impressive in their detail and their calibration. And there are people who are arriving for the first time. Who post hesitantly, apologizing in advance for being new, asking if this is the right place to ask. Who list 2 or 3 things they have listened to or watched and ask, with a kind of hopeful tentativeness, whether anyone has recommendations for where to go next. And almost always, someone answers. Often several people answer, with specific, thoughtful suggestions tailored to what the newcomer described. These exchanges are small, but they are not insignificant. They are how a community sustains itself. They are how an archive grows. There is also, in these threads, a space for the difficult question. For the listener who says, I have been following this case for years, and something in the recent coverage has started to feel wrong to me, and I'm not sure whether that instinct is correct or whether I need more information. Or the listener who says, I found a piece of media I found compelling, but I am uncomfortable with one of the choices the creator made, and I am trying to articulate why. These conversations are often the most interesting ones. They do not resolve easily. They tend to produce not a consensus but a range of thoughtful, incompatible perspectives, each of which illuminates a different facet of the underlying question. This is what good investigative thinking looks like, whether it happens in a newsroom or in a Reddit thread. You find the thing that doesn't fit. You hold it up to the light. You turn it around. You ask what it looks like from different angles. You don't force it into a shape it doesn't want to take. Part 6, The Creators in the Room. What does it mean to make true crime, and then sit beside the audience that consumes it? The monthly thread has a specific provision for this. Content creators are explicitly welcome to share their work. They can post a link. They can describe what they do and why they do it. They can be part of the conversation not as experts above the audience but as participants within it. This structural choice, the decision to include creators and audience in the same space, without elevation or hierarchy, is, I think, one of the more underappreciated things about how the true crime community organizes itself online. In most media contexts, the relationship between creator and audience is vertical. The creator produces, the audience consumes. The feedback loop, if it exists at all, is mediated and delayed. The creator, in a practical sense, is always speaking to a room they cannot see. But in a thread like this one, the creator can sit beside the audience. Can read what the audience is saying they need. Can respond, in real time, to specific questions. Can hear, without filtration, what is landing and what is missing and what is needed that doesn't yet exist. Imagine being a podcast producer and reading a thread full of people describing what they're looking for, the gap in the true crime landscape that nobody has filled, the kind of storytelling they keep searching for and not quite finding. And then you have the specific, actionable information you need to make the next thing. Not because you are cynically chasing an audience, but because you understand, now, what genuine need exists. Some of the creators who post in these threads are one-person operations. Someone with a microphone and a hard drive and years of investigative research who has been slowly building a podcast in their spare time, on weekends, around a full-time job. Someone who believes in a particular case with a specific and personal intensity and has decided that the best way they can contribute to its eventual resolution is to tell the story as carefully and completely as they know how. These creators are not chasing listeners in a commercial sense. They are, in many cases, subsidizing their own work. They are losing money on the thing they believe in most. And they come to threads like this one not to advertise but to find, if they're lucky, someone who has been waiting for exactly what they are making. The comment that says, I have been looking for this for 2 years. I cannot believe you found this angle. I am going to listen to every episode this weekend. That comment means something different to a creator who has spent 18 months and considerable personal cost building something they were not sure anyone would find. It means the archive is not empty. It means the work reached someone. It means the effort was not invisible. This generosity of orientation, the decision to function as a recommender rather than a promoter even when you have something to promote, is one of the markers of a creator who has earned their place in this community. And the community notices. And it rewards it, not with immediate commercial return, but with the more durable currency of genuine trust. Part 7, Cold Cases and Open Questions. What remains unresolved, and why does it matter? People who follow cold cases develop a specific kind of patience. It is different from ordinary patience. It is the patience of someone who has accepted that the answer may not come in their lifetime, and has decided to pay attention anyway. Because paying attention is itself a form of respect for the people at the center of the case. Because the act of sustained attention keeps the question alive in a way that matters, even when no new evidence is forthcoming. In recommendation threads, the cold case recommendations are often the most carefully written ones. The person leaving the recommendation is usually someone who has followed the case for years. They know the timeline with precision. They understand the evidentiary complexities. They can describe, in a paragraph, the 3 or 4 competing theories and the degree to which each is supported or undermined by the known evidence. Their recommendation is not casual. It is a passing of stewardship. Here, they are saying, I have been carrying this. Now you know where it is. You can carry it too, if you choose. This language of carrying, of stewardship, of sustained attention across years, comes up repeatedly when you listen carefully to how true crime communities talk about their engagement with cases. It is not the language of entertainment. It is the language of obligation. The obligation not to forget. Families of victims in unresolved cases sometimes speak about the true crime community in this light. Not always with pure gratitude, there are legitimate concerns about privacy, about the pain of having an unresolved loss become public entertainment, about the ways in which well-intentioned but uninformed public attention can actually complicate ongoing investigations. These concerns are real and they should not be minimized. But alongside those concerns, some families describe the experience of knowing that strangers around the world have read the case files and listened to every available interview and are thinking, carefully, about what might have been missed, and they find in that knowledge something meaningful. Not a solution. Not justice. Not an end to the grief. But the knowledge that their person is not forgotten. That the question of what happened to them has not been quietly filed away. This is not nothing. These outcomes are not common. The vast majority of cold cases remain cold, regardless of how much public attention they receive. The factors that keep cases unresolved, the absence of forensic evidence, the passage of time, the death of potential witnesses, the jurisdictional complications of cases that cross state or international lines, do not yield to enthusiasm, however genuine. But the possibility exists. And the community holds that possibility carefully, aware of its limits, unwilling to abandon it entirely. Part 8, The Ethics of Attention. What do we owe the people whose stories we consume? This is the question that sits at the center of every serious discussion about true crime as a genre and as a cultural practice. It is not a comfortable question. And it does not have a clean answer. When we listen to a podcast about a murder case, we are engaging with the documentation of an act that destroyed specific human lives. A person is dead. Someone, in the resolved cases, a named individual, in the unresolved ones, an unknown, made a decision that ended that life. Families were shattered. Communities were changed. The aftermath, the grief, the legal process, the long institutional response, involved real people in real pain for years, sometimes decades. Our listening cannot change any of that. We are downstream of events we did not witness and could not prevent. We arrive as what we are, an audience. And the act of consuming this material as an audience carries an ethical weight that the best participants in the true crime community have been grappling with, seriously and collectively, for years. What do we owe the victim? We owe them, at minimum, the recognition that they were a whole person. Not a case. Not an incident. Not a story. A person who had a life before the event that ended or devastated it. The recommendation threads of communities like r/true crime are filled with praise for journalism and documentary filmmaking that does this work, that places the victim at the center not as a victim, but as a person. Who restores the daily texture of their life, the music they loved, the work they did, the relationships they maintained, the particular and irreplaceable way they moved through the world. This is the first and most fundamental ethical obligation of true crime journalism. And it is, gratifyingly, the standard that the audience most consistently holds the work to. What do we owe the family? We owe them, at minimum, the recognition that their loss did not end with the crime. That the investigation, the trial, the public attention, the ongoing uncertainty of an unresolved case, these are not narrative beats. They are the ongoing reality of people's lives. The family that gave interviews to a documentary crew in 2015 is still living in the aftermath of their loss in 2025. They did not leave the story when the documentary ended. They are still inside it. The best true crime journalism maintains a relationship with the people at the center of its stories. It checks in. It asks permission before returning. It asks whether survivors want to be included in updated coverage, and it accepts no for an answer. It treats the ongoing consent of the people involved as a living, breathing thing that requires continuous renewal, not a waiver signed at the beginning of a project that then licenses everything thereafter. What do we owe the community? This is perhaps the most complex obligation. The community in which a crime occurs carries the weight of it for a long time after the media has moved on. Particularly in cases involving systematic failures, failures of law enforcement, failures of social services, failures of community institutions that should have protected vulnerable people and did not, the community is left to reckon with those failures while the journalists who exposed them return to other stories. The true crime audience, to its credit, tends to remain with these stories after the initial coverage cycle ends. They return to cases after verdicts. They follow the appeals process. They read the family's public statements. They remain, in a sense, present with the ongoing aftermath in a way that industrial journalism often is not. And this sustained presence, this refusal to simply close the tab and move on, is one of the genuine ethical contributions of a serious, engaged true crime audience. Part 9, The Archive as Justice. Can bearing witness, at this scale, constitute a form of justice? This is a question worth spending some time with. Justice, in its formal sense, is a legal process. It involves evidence and argumentation and adjudication. It involves a verdict rendered by a body with the authority to render it. It involves, ideally, a reckoning that is proportionate and meaningful and that provides some form of closure, however incomplete, to the people most directly harmed by the crime. True crime journalism is not justice in this sense. It cannot convict or acquit. It cannot restore what was lost. It cannot compel the institutions it criticizes to reform themselves, though it can create conditions in which reform becomes harder to resist. It cannot give a family back the person they lost. And yet, there is something that happens when a story is told well enough, widely enough, and with enough sustained attention that it cannot be ignored. Something that is adjacent to justice, if not identical to it. A form of public reckoning that operates outside the formal legal system but that is not therefore without consequence. Cold cases have been reopened because of media attention. Wrongful convictions have been overturned because investigative journalists refuse to accept the official verdict as the final word. Institutional failures have been addressed, sometimes partially, sometimes slowly, but addressed, because a documentary or a podcast created a public record of those failures that officials could not simply deny. Perpetrators have come forward, or been identified, because a well-constructed media narrative circulated the right details to the right people at the right moment. These outcomes are rare. The vast majority of true crime coverage does not directly alter the legal landscape of the cases it documents. The majority of cold cases remain cold. The majority of institutional failures addressed in documentaries continue, in modified forms, in the institutions themselves. The majority of the justice the true crime audience hopes for remains beyond reach. But the archive remains. The record remains. Every carefully reported podcast episode, every rigorously researched documentary, every book that spent years constructing a definitive account of a case, these things are part of a growing public record that says, this happened. These are the facts. These are the people involved. This is what was done, and what was not done, and what that difference cost. That record has value. It has value to the historians who will examine this period of American criminal justice from a distance. It has value to the legal reformers who need documented evidence of systemic failure to make the case for change. It has value to the families, who find in it not resolution but recognition. And it has value to the larger culture, which needs to be reminded, regularly and in specific terms, of what it means when the systems designed to protect people fail them. This is what the archive is. Not entertainment. Not speculation. Not a community of people morbidly fixated on violence. It is a vast, distributed, imperfect, earnestly maintained attempt to create a record. To say, we were here. We paid attention. We did not look away. Part 10, What Good Crime Media Does. When the work is done right, what exactly has been accomplished? Let me describe something specific. A family has lived with an unresolved death for 15 years. The investigation was closed, not officially, but practically. The detective who worked the case retired. The file was transferred to a different department and sat, for years, without meaningful activity. The family's calls to law enforcement were returned with decreasing frequency and increasing brevity. They were not forgotten in their own lives, they lived with the loss every day, but they were functionally invisible to the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Then a journalist spends 18 months on the case. They file public records requests. They interview surviving witnesses who were never formally interviewed by investigators. They consult forensic specialists who review the original evidence with current tools. They speak to the family extensively, with patience and with care, over many months. They produce a work, a podcast, a documentary, a long-form article, a book, that presents the case in its full complexity. They do not promise an answer. They promise a thorough examination. The work is released. It reaches the true crime community. It is discussed in threads like the monthly recommendation thread, carefully and in detail, by people who bring their own knowledge and frameworks to the analysis. Questions are asked in these threads that the journalism itself raised but did not answer. The community holds those questions. Someone in a distant city, reading those threads, recognizes something. A name. A place. A detail that connects to something they know from their own life, their own work, their own experience. They contact the journalist. The journalist contacts investigators. Investigators reopen the file. This scenario is not common. But it is also not unprecedented. It has happened. It has happened more than once. And the pathway from a family's invisible grief to a renewed investigation passes, in these cases, through the community. Through the people who read the thread and listened to the episode and stayed with the question after the credits rolled. There is also the less dramatic but equally important work of changing how people understand the systems around them. A listener who spent 30 hours with a podcast about a wrongful conviction understands the mechanics of tunnel vision in criminal investigation in a way that no civics class could have taught them. A reader who worked through a book about a serial killer's capture understands the evolution of forensic science and its limitations in a way that changes how they relate to crime coverage going forward. A viewer who watched a documentary about a missing person case understands the racialized disparities in how disappearances are investigated and reported in a way that makes them a more attentive citizen. These are not small things. These are the changes that a genre, practiced well, makes in the people who engage with it seriously. And they compound. The audience member who understands wrongful conviction better is more likely to be a juror who applies appropriate scrutiny to prosecution evidence. The audience member who understands racial disparities in crime reporting is more likely to notice and object to them in their local media ecosystem. The audience member who has spent years with cold case coverage is more likely to take seriously the importance of accessible public records and transparent law enforcement practices. True crime, at its best, makes more informed, more empathetic, more critically engaged citizens. That is not a small accomplishment. Part 11, The Next Thing We Need. What is the true crime landscape missing, and who might fill it? Every genre has its gaps. And the true crime community, with its habit of careful collective attention, has identified the gaps in its own genre with considerable specificity. This is a market failure, in the strict sense. There is demand, the recommendation threads demonstrate this demand clearly, for coverage of cases involving communities of color, cases involving rural America, cases involving victims who were poor or homeless or involved in criminal economies that make their stories harder to tell without careful contextual work. The demand exists. The supply does not, in sufficient quantity or quality. The gap is beginning to narrow. There are journalists and documentarians and podcasters who are doing this work specifically, as a political and ethical commitment. Who are building the relationships in underserved communities that allow them to tell these stories with the depth and the consent of the people involved. Who are finding, in grant funding and community support and the slow, compound interest of audience loyalty, the economic basis for work that the commercial market would not support. These creators appear in recommendation threads. They are noticed. They are shared. The community directs its attention toward them, and that attention translates, slowly, into the sustainability that allows the work to continue. Another persistent gap is longitudinal coverage. Most true crime media, even the best of it, tells the story up to a point and then stops. The podcast series concludes. The documentary is released. The book is published. And the case continues. The trial that was ongoing when the podcast finished is now concluded, with results that may or may not align with the narrative the podcast constructed. The family whose grief was documented in the documentary has moved through another 5 years of living, and that living has changed them in ways the documentary could not anticipate. The recommendation community consistently asks for follow-up coverage. They ask for the creators who are willing to return to their stories after the initial release. Who publish update episodes. Who write postscripts and revised editions. Who remain in relationship with their subjects over time and report on what has changed. This request is both a practical audience desire and a meaningful ethical one. The subjects of crime journalism did not leave the story when the journalism ended. The journalism should not leave them. There is also a gap in the coverage of the investigative process itself, the actual, procedural, institutional machinery of criminal investigation. Most true crime media uses the investigation as backdrop, as the mechanism by which the story is revealed. Fewer pieces of crime journalism treat the investigation itself as the subject. The ways in which forensic science has evolved and the ways in which outdated forensic methods have led to wrongful convictions. The ways in which prosecutorial decisions are made and the incentives that shape those decisions. The ways in which detective training affects the quality of investigations in specific, documentable ways. This institutional journalism is harder to make engaging for a general audience, and its absence in the true crime landscape reflects that difficulty. But the community, in its recommendation threads, regularly signals appetite for exactly this kind of work. They are not looking only for narrative. They are looking for understanding. An understanding of the systems within which crime is investigated and adjudicated is, ultimately, as important as any individual case. The content creators who post in these threads, the small and medium operations, the one-person podcast laboring through its first season, the writer who has been working on a single case for 4 years, these are the people who might fill some of these gaps. They are already, in many cases, trying to. They arrive in the thread not only to share what they have made but to listen to what is needed. And the community, without quite orchestrating it, does something valuable in return, it tells them. Part 12, What the Thread Knows. At the end of all this, what does this community, this monthly gathering of listeners and readers and watchers and creators, actually know that we should be paying attention to. It knows that the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we choose not to tell, are a form of value judgment. They reflect, in aggregate, what a culture believes is worth remembering. The recommendation thread, in its small way, is an ongoing argument about what is worth remembering. And the people who participate in it are, in their own modest way, making a claim about the values that should govern that argument. They are saying, tell the story of the person who was forgotten. Tell the story of the case that was closed without resolution. Tell the story that the official record got wrong, and tell it again until the record is corrected. Tell the story of the institution that failed, and tell it with enough specificity that the failure cannot be denied or dismissed. Tell the story with the full cooperation and dignity of the family, and if the family does not want the story told, honor that too. Tell the story that has never been told, and tell it first to the community that has been waiting for it. These are not small demands. They are not the demands of an audience looking for entertainment. They are the demands of an audience that has decided this work matters. That it has consequences. That it should be held to a standard proportionate to those consequences. And the creators who are doing the best work in true crime are, increasingly, meeting those demands. Not perfectly. No journalism is perfect, no documentary is perfect, no book is perfect. But with a seriousness of purpose and a caliber of execution that the audience has noticed, and named, and directed each other toward. Someone just posted a question. They're new. They're not sure where to start. They've been thinking about a particular case, one they heard mentioned in passing, one that lodged in them for reasons they haven't fully articulated. They want to know, is there something out there that would help them understand it better? Is there someone who has done the work? Is there a journalist or a filmmaker or a podcaster who took this case seriously and told it with the care it deserves? And someone will answer. Someone is already typing. This is the archive. This is the community. This is the slow, cumulative, collective act of paying attention to things that deserve to be paid attention to. Not for the thrill. Not for the drama. But because the stories at the center of this genre, the lives disrupted or ended by violence, the investigations that succeeded or failed, the families that have been waiting for answers for years, the systems that keep producing the same failures in new forms, these stories are not entertainment. They are history. They are testimony. They are the shape of what we have done to each other, and what we are still doing, and what a community of careful, persistent, ethically serious people is refusing to let us forget. The archive grows. Someone somewhere is pressing play on something they've been meaning to listen to for months. They found the recommendation in a thread. Someone described it carefully, the pacing, the evidence, the treatment of the family, the honesty about what remains unresolved. They described it with the particular care of someone passing along something they want to make sure arrives intact. The listener presses play. And the work continues. Closing meditation. There is a kind of quiet courage in sustained attention. In refusing to look away. In returning, again and again, to the questions that do not have easy answers. The true crime community, at its best, is a community of people practicing this courage together. In the dark. In headphones. In the small hours of the morning when the world is still and the mind is open and the stories we carry can be held a little more gently. Tonight, wherever you are, I hope you found something worth carrying. A question you hadn't considered. A story you want to find. A case that will sit with you quietly for a few days, the way the best stories do, not loudly, not urgently, but with the gentle, persistent pressure of something that matters and knows it. The thread is always open. The archive never closes. And somewhere in it, there is a story waiting for exactly the attention you have to give it. Rest now. Let the questions rest with you. Tomorrow, if you're curious, you'll know where to look. The work continues. Quietly. Carefully. As it should. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?